contributing editor at The Atlantic, senior columnist at The Forward, and a professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. He's written a bunch of pieces recently on the Democrats' failure to come up with a China policy that varies from Trump's, the party's hawkishness on Iran, and the weakness of the rhetoric coming from most Democratic presidential candidates when it comes to Israel and the illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. Peter, by the way, as editor of the New Republic magazine back in 2003, enthusiastically supported the invasion of Iraq. But I think it's fair to say he holds a very different view today and is now a leading US media critic of the quote-unquote forever wars. He joins me now. Peter, thanks for joining me on Deconstructed.
My pleasure.
Peter, am I being unfair when I say the Democrats haven't just failed to match the boldness and radicalism on domestic policy that they're showing these days with boldness and radicalism on foreign policy? They haven't just failed to match that on foreign policy, but the foreign policy isn't even getting a look in when you look at the campaigns of most of the Democratic presidential candidates.
No, I think that's fair. They're not talking about it very much, partly because it's not what's mostly on voters' minds, which is the norm in the United States when the United States is not in a war where a lot of Americans are dying. That's just the reality of our political system. But I also don't think they're doing very much to kind of generate the kind of conversation in the Democratic Party that will be necessary for them to build a mandate to really change things if they get in office.
Good point. People always forget about that idea that you have to, lay the groundwork if you want to make changes in office. In the way they have done on Medicare for All, for example. It's been going on for a few years now, moving that debate on healthcare. The Democrats on foreign policy seem to want to go back to business as usual on foreign policy, back to a pre-Trump era, even though I would argue that business as usual and the pre-Trump era was pretty shitty in terms of American policy on human rights, democracy, greenhouse gas emissions, and the rest.
Yeah, I think Bernie Sanders is a little bit of an exception to that. Hillary Clinton, I think it's worth remembering, in 2016 was running a little bit to Obama's right on foreign policy. She was a little bit more hawkish. To be fair, the Democrats aren't doing that. They might be even a quarter of a step more dovish than Obama. But what they're not doing, which is the big distinction that you're rightly making, is they're not really trying to break down the ideological boundaries that have defined foreign policy in the way they are with domestic policy. And I think
And why do you think that is?
I think it's, again, I think partly because they don't feel that the public is not demanding it. But I also think that the foreign policy establishment, the people who make foreign policy, many of whom are, good, well-meaning people, but I think they are more insulated from public pressure. And they are not, they've not had to kind of grapple with the deep sense of failure and radicalism that has emerged among ordinary grassroots Democrats. They remain fairly insulated from that. And that's because foreign policy in the United States is a much more elite-driven business than domestic policy.
Yes, with very little accountability. The people who all got Iraq wrong or other wars wrong are still around advocating for new wars. You mentioned the whole concept of whether you're a tad to the left or right of Obama or Clinton. You wrote a piece late last year for The Atlantic where you made the point, a very valid point, that a lot of the Democrats, senior Democrats in D.C. have been attacking Trump from the right on foreign policy when you look at things like China or Russia or North Korea. Do you think that's a strategic move on their part, or they genuinely believe this stuff? They genuinely want to have a hawkish position on North Korea forever?
I think it's a bit of both. I think there is certainly a long hangover which started from the post-Vietnam era and was reinvigorated a little bit in the post-9/11 era of Democrats always looking for over their right shoulder and fearing not to be seen as tough enough, especially when it comes to anything. And that's partly because the Republican Party had kind of become the party that was more entrenched in the military over the decades. But I also think that there is a notion of what is responsible in foreign policy that is often not really very seriously and thoughtfully questioned. So, a notion that that the expansion of the American military footprint is, all things being equal, kind of always synonymous with enhancing the well-being of ordinary Americans. And I think one of the reasons that Trump won the Republican primary in particular, and that also helped him in the general election, was that he was actually willing to challenge that equation. And I think that Democrats, although Trump's own foreign policy has been totally disastrous, I think actually that would be a good place for Democrats to start in rethinking some of the basic assumptions that tend to lead to this kind of expansionist foreign policy that we have.
It was amazing in 2015, 2016, the way in which he upended the Republican Party consensus on foreign policy compared to Mitt Romney's platform in 2012. I remember seeing, when he made the comment about John McCain, I like people who aren't captured. We thought his campaign was over in 2015. You can't attack a war hero on the right. And he got away with it. When he stood in the debates, I remember watching the debate on TV where he said, well, George W. Bush, what did he say? 9/11 happened on his watch. He kind of mocked Jeb. And the crowd, some people in the crowd booed, but others cheered. And the next day, it didn't affect his poll rating at all. And of course, he went on about how he had been anti-war in Iraq, which he wasn't. He lied, but he said he was. He said he was anti-war in Libya. Again, he lied, but he said he was. And it all helped him. It didn't hurt him. And I wonder where in 2020, in this race on the Democratic side, let's talk about Bernie. Is Bernie Sanders a person who's willing to do that in this race, upend things?
More than any other candidate. Again, I think it's partly because just he's more distant from the Democratic foreign policy establishment. And I think he's begun to do some of that. So he has, for instance, asked the question, really, is Saudi Arabia really morally superior to Iran, for instance? Why necessarily? The mainstream Democratic view is kind of, yes, the Iran deal was good, but we need to take a very hawkish position on Iran because they are a uniquely aggressive and immoral actor in the Middle East. So you see a kind of a half step in a positive direction towards Trump, but not a really fundamental kind of questioning of some of the deeper assumptions, right? I mean, I think the Islamic Republic of Rajam is a really odious regime in terms of what they do domestically, and I think they do a lot of bad stuff in the region. But when one looks at their prime regional competitors, particularly, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, I find it very difficult to see that there's an important moral distinction, and I think it would be better for the United States to actually try to have a business-like working relationship with both of those regimes in order to give ourselves the most leverage and for us to try to cool down, to try to kind of diffuse the Cold War in the region rather than heating it up. And it's striking to me that that's still not, except for Bernie a little bit, that's not really something you hear from the Democratic candidates.
No,